risk that potentially it'll start to focus down on things that they're. Okay, keep the cynic mindset in the back of the head.
Yeah, so we actually partner with former Secretary of Defense, we partner with his security organization, out of the U.S., and get a lot of guidance from them. And we talk to them regularly about different things, CSC and all the changes that we are making right now. So we've got a lot of people eyes on that as they start to go a different direction. We'll be analyzing that very quickly. So yeah, good point.
I would have asked it if we had time, but because it's something that, yeah, that's okay.
I want to try to do a lot more into that release or that presentation last week.
Thank you. That's good. So you are with okay. The pass line.
Gotcha.
We're running good. I'm done, mate. We'll be on time. Okay, let's get the show on the road for this afternoon. I'd just kick it off really quickly. Let's just welcome Garrett from Mimecast talking about email and cyber resiliency.
Thank you. So, folks, looking to talk today about this idea of cyber resilience and plan to kind of, I suppose, to do a little bit of framing. I would guess at this stage you've probably heard a bit of stuff around what's happening in the cybercrime area. So I'm going to cover that very briefly, zone into email, talk about cyber resilience and what that perspective means for organizations. Also want to talk a little bit about cloud and that idea of how that aligns with cyber resilience as a strategy for organizations. I'm going to try and stay away from product. It's not really a Mimecast session, but I will refer to some of the stuff that we do and some of the gotchas that we've kind of come across when it comes to mostly the security side of things, and to sort of inform the talk. So Mimecast, for those who don't know, it's a cloud service provider, and we do email, and really email is actually all that we do. So email security, data assurance through archiving, and business continuity through the cloud as well. So kind of covering those main areas, and focused entirely on the email side of things. I work as a tech consultant for that company, so I'm one of the guys who goes out and talks to organizations as they're looking to make the change, go to cloud, fix some issues that they have with email security, and that's kind of my background. So to kick it off, a really kind of, I suppose, a brief mention of the stuff that we're seeing, and I believe you probably had this, or at least some of this in the talk before, but that idea that every time you open your IT news, you're going to see big numbers from companies that have been hit by whaling attacks or cybercrime and ransomware. And massive numbers. You know, just before Christmas, there was a South Australian company that got done for 1.5 million. And we kind of know that this stuff is happening. I think the data breach reporting laws in Australia will probably change the stories that we see. But it's sort of, you know, you look at the US and there's big numbers over there for whaling attacks where they're talking like 48 million for Ubiquity Networks. Mattel, the guys who make the Barbie dolls, got done for like 3 mil. And so it's those kind of big numbers. But I think Bruce Schneier last year at the AusCERT conference was talking about that idea that this is going to get more important, that right now we're talking about business impact mostly, but as things like IoT devices come online, and even with WannaCry, when you look at that, like there was Bayer and Siemens medical imaging devices that got hit by that. So you're going to start seeing this kind of evolution where it's not just about money or financial loss or even reputation for organizations, but actually you'll start seeing it impacting human lives. And even with WannaCry, there was those stories about people not being able to get in to get surgery and being turned away from hospitals. So like this stuff is important, but it's getting more and more important. And that's kind of the high level stuff that we see in the newspapers, like drilling into the things that we see often on email, but also things like WannaCry. These are like the end user experiences that security teams, that IT teams are kind of battling day in, day out. And there's things like malicious URLs coming through on emails from the AFP or AusPost, utility bills. And as I was having conversations last night and today, this seems to be the stuff that's just very much being bombarded, organizations are being bombarded by. Malicious attachments. So you've got a document from the scanner, click on it and open it. And all ultimately with a view to generally ransomware or some sort of an attack to extract money or information from an organization. And WannaCry is on there. In reality, obviously, it wasn't an email threat. It was through the SMB protocol, but it's there because in terms of data assurance, which fits in with the cyber resilience piece, that's kind of why it's relevant to what we're talking about here. So probably skim through this relatively quickly given the audience, but the reason why we're here is the obsession that companies seem to have with making known their leadership team, making sure that they're on LinkedIn, that they're connected to their customers, and they tell people what they're going to do on Twitter. So everything's out there, very easy to use OSINT tools like Buscador, those kind of tools for harvesting this information that's just out there. It's not hidden in any way, and then correlating that and using that as a way to affect the attacks. And that's become much more sophisticated. So you've got the prevalence of people being out there talking about what they're doing, but you've also got these more sophisticated tools and people who literally spend their lives studying the ways of social engineering and NLP and how to get into organizations. The rise of obviously cryptocurrencies given a way to pull money out of organizations anonymously is a huge factor as well. So it makes it really, really easy. You don't even have to use a mule account, although with whaling attacks, that's generally where that's approached. So that's kind of where we're at, and the reality is that email is the #1 attack vector, kind of has been for many years, probably will continue to be so. That's supported by many, many studies. We've got one from PhishMe that's 91% of attacks started with a phishing email, but the Verizon data breach reports, Wired reports, there's lots of reports out there will tell you that this is the way that people get in most easily, and that makes sense. If you think about all the other vectors, whether it's a kind of network attack or leaving a USB drive somewhere, they're harder and they leave you open to a little bit more exposure in terms of you might show up in a CCTV, etc. So email is ridiculously easy. It's like a 5-lane highway that runs straight into an organization, and you can't switch it off. It's how we communicate. It's where we talk to our colleagues. It's where we talk to our clients. It's how we send documents around. So it's this backbone to communications. And the people on the end of it are not tech savvy necessarily, right? They're lawyers, they're CFOs, they're PAs, and they're not necessarily people who are tasked with understanding security. So that's kind of the probably the starting point with looking at cyber resilience and email specifically. The next two stats really are around that idea that it's increasing. So not only is it there, it's the most popular attack vector. You don't need anything other than the ability to send an email. You can be anywhere in the world, and why wouldn't you do that? Compared to running drugs or human trafficking or weapons, where there's kind of places that you're going to get the death penalty. With email, there you go. You can sit anywhere in the globe, send an email to an organization, and you're really only looking for a small hit rate, but it's worth it. So it'll massively fund organized crime. So spear phishing is up. The FBI is talking about a 1,300% increase in the losses due to whaling attacks or impersonation attacks. PhishMe and Microsoft both came out with 400% increase in ransomware attacks. So it's there, but it's getting worse. And that's kind of where we're kind of zone into to talk today. So then to kind of get into the idea of cyber resilience, And for me, it's kind of nothing new in terms of its component parts. It's stuff that we really have kind of done for a long time. But what it is a different perspective, and really kind of revolves around that idea that you can do your best to protect an organization, but you got to be realistic and sort of think and assume that actually there's a pretty good chance that you're going to get a pop. And what are you going to do? Like, what's your plan? What's going to happen during that event? What's going to happen after that event? So it brings information security, it brings data assurance, and business continuity all together, and kind of gives you that perspective. So there's no kind of amazing revelation, but it's just a way of thinking that's a slight shift, and kind of getting, I think, traction. Organizations like ASIC talk about it as a #1 priority for financial services industry. So that's kind of the high-level view of that. So in terms of thinking about it, it really boils down to the before, during, and after approach, and looking at malicious intent. That's everywhere. That's cybercrime. Constantly, organizations are getting popped. The conversations last night and today, like it's a madness how much stuff is being dealt with day to day. So probably don't really need to kind of talk too much to that. But human error, it's always existed. So long as people are doing things, people make mistakes, and that's not going to change. So you think about last year with Telstra, where they had a technician who kind of doing his job, tried to fix an issue and rebooted or restarted one of their nodes and literally brought down Telstra's network. 3G gone, 4G gone, FBOS is out, cab charges out, and it's just one person doing the wrong thing, not following a process. And cyber resilience is about thinking and accepting that we make mistakes and we will continue to make mistakes. I remember probably 17 years ago, I was a developer for a call accounting company in Sydney. And it was pre-OneDrive days, pre-Dropbox. And I needed to get call accounting data from a customer that was kind of fairly far away. And I said, well, I'll set up an FTP site. I'll get the data, and then I'll kill the FTP site, and we're good to go. And it worked beautifully. I was able to do that, got the data, was able to code away and kind of continue work. And then 3 weeks later, the managing director walked into the office, red-faced with the ISP bill and kind of wondering why it was 25 times bigger than it normally was. And it was one of those moments where you know straight away that you've made such a huge mistake that I forgot to turn off the FTP side or kill it. Hadn't secured it, and I'm embarrassed to say that in front of this audience, but in my head I was like, I'll spin it up, I'll use it, and I'll kill it. Totally forgot. And so when we looked at the server, it was full of videos, it was full of movies, albums, and one of those kind of one of those mistakes you kind of do and you'll never do again in your career. So I kind of get the human error thing. And then technical failure, like stuff breaks. That's the reality. You'll get, at the worst time possible, you'll get things happening, and you got to deal with that and accept that things go wrong. So that idea that like big companies like Salesforce, for example, had a bug in their firmware for the storage arrays, and there was data loss. There was customers that lost data there that it's not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to get back to. So with cyber resilience, it's that idea of having a second store. Like the ownership is on the organization to make sure that they're covered. That move to cloud isn't a move away from responsibility. There's still an element of you've got to kind of cover yourself and have that stuff available in the event of an attack or whatever it might be. Office 365 last year, there was a 9-hour outage where they looked to upgrade the EOP infrastructure, and basically there was problems there. And for 9 hours, people on the last day of the quarter, actually for the US guys, weren't able to use email. So these are the sort of things that we're kind of thinking about, but it's really of looking at that sort of before, during, and after mentality, accepting that things will go wrong. What are we going to do to maintain business operations during the event, and what are we going to do afterwards? And ultimately, that's kind of all cyber resilience is. It's that idea of uninterrupted business. So using the best possible protection and in terms of email, but it applies across the board. It's not just email. This is a bigger picture view. Making sure that users can continue to communicate. So if something does go wrong, you're in a position to make sure that users are enabled to keep on working, keep on sending and receiving emails, and make sure that the data is protected, that it's safe, it's got a second store, it's somewhere that can be easily interacted with, and that's the ultimate goal, that kind of uninterrupted business approach. So I'm going to talk a little bit then about the shift to cloud. And specifically here, I suppose to me there's different versions of cloud. And I think there's a version of cloud that has come from organizations that can see there's a massive shift and need to bring a product to market. So they'll talk to the product team and they'll say, well, yeah, we can do that. And they'll take an appliance and make a VM of it and host that somewhere, and then that's their cloud solution. And I'd argue that while that can be very good, there are limitations there that you'll kind of get around if you go with a true cloud or a grid approach to cloud infrastructure, or that idea of hyperscale, so infinitely, indefinitely expandable, kind of a horizontal expansion. So as there's extra requirements for resources, you can literally just slot in extra hardware, and that is going to uptick and provide the resources for whatever the service is. In this case, with the idea of cyber resilience, probably the first thing to think about is security. And the natural thing that falls out of something like hyperscale is that you're in a multi-tenancy environment with a massive amount of resources available. So in this case, when an email comes through, all of a sudden you can do very, very sophisticated and detailed checking on that email. So multiple engines for viruses, multiple engines for spam, multiple engines for URL checking. That really, there's a limit you will hit with a VM, or certainly an on-premises approach, where that just becomes very difficult to bordering on impossible. So that's kind of the first part. The other part would be around data assurance, and that ability for something that's a hyperscale or a cloud solution to deliver things like email search results very, very quickly, so that end users are using their mobile device, so it's an Android device or an iOS device, or using Outlook, that they're not waiting, that there's no impact to productivity, and there's no feeling of frustration, and that's something else that falls out of this. And then continuity, and that idea that if it's built correctly, a cloud solution should really have very, very close to 100% uptime, and in some instances, it really should be 100% uptime. And that can be supported with ISO certifications, so the 22301 around business continuity to make sure that whatever the offering is, that it actually will support that cyber resilience approach. So for email, it gets really simple. Like it's the security stuff, and we've all been doing that for a long time. It's considering continuity, and that idea that even if we're going to the cloud and looking at things like Office 365 for email, still a responsibility to make sure that if there's an issue with that platform, you can continue sending and receiving emails, in this case emails, and then the archiving, so around data assurance. So really that's kind of it. So now I want to kind of drill into those, and I'm going to talk to the advanced security stuff. And it's really all the conversations that I had last night were around this. We've kind of moved on from the point where AV and AS is considered enough. That idea that you can do a perimeter check, look up a signature of known bad things, and then block it if it's on the list. That's fallen apart. Like it's necessary. It hasn't gone away, but the evolution now is that you'll get a URL through, and that URL in and of itself is just a URL, right? It doesn't do anything. It's what happens when somebody clicks on that URL that causes all the issues, or attachments will come through. And those macros, if you look at the macro, it's not doing anything, but what it is doing is collecting the code or connecting to a command and control center, and that's kind of where your problems are going to arise. So what we're seeing is this kind of shift where that perimeter protection, it's still needed, it still exists, but actually what you're seeing is a kind of a pull into the business, so further inside, leveraging cloud solutions, so you can apply very sophisticated checking to things like URLs without introducing latency. So using that hyperscale idea, lots of engines do a really good check on the URL and make sure that it's safe before somebody can go to the website, or attachments that are sandboxed before they get delivered down. So we've seen that kind of evolution happen. I'm throwing this up here really just to show, I suppose, so this was a study that we did with a global media company, and they had an incumbent security solution in place. I show this more, like it's sort of a sales slide, but kind of thought it was interesting in terms of the difference, what people are kind of used to and have almost become expectant of in some ways, where people think, that's just how it is. And I'd argue that it sort of isn't, and you can do a better job of email security. And it's, whatever about spam, I think the things that are interesting is things like impersonation attacks, using sandboxing to catch the unknown malware stuff. But really, this is about sort of highlighting, I suppose, the evolution and the difference between incumbent, potentially on-premises approaches and what you can get through with a hyperscale cloud approach. So talking about what's happening here, obviously all the primary checks are still going to happen. So DOS protection, recipient validation, all the things that you would expect to happen on email, your normal AV, AS, all standard stuff. The conversations we're having more and more often are about the second or lower half of this kind of cloud diagram. And it's around looking at attachments in an intelligent way. It's around looking at malicious URLs. It's around protecting against whaling attacks and using that scale to inform what patterns make it obvious or are indicators that something is a whaling attack. So we're seeing that kind of evolve, and I thought it might be, based on the conversations that we've been having, useful to kind of talk through some of the gotchas and some of the things that we see in the market sometimes, and how we've had to change how we do things to cater for how the threats have evolved as well. So this is a fairly simple logic flow for what many platforms will now do in terms of protecting against malicious URLs. So that idea that as an email comes through, the link gets rewritten, and that's kind of the first step. What that means is you're not doing a perimeter check, and that falls apart really quickly. So if you do a perimeter check on a URL, like, what are you going to do? You just send an email on a Sunday morning when no one's in the office, goes through, sitting in everyone's mailbox, and on a Monday morning, folks come in, probably had a few drinks on the weekend, probably a little bit tired, don't want their phone to get cut off, so they click on the pay bill now, and then you've got a problem. You have to rely on your endpoint or your web filtering to make sure that that's okay. So the proxying of links means that you're able to do this real-time scan of any site that's being visited. Now, I'd argue where it gets interesting is the ability to scale and choose and be dynamic with the engines that you're going to use to protect your organization. So things that should be happening there is obviously reputation checks is a very basic check, and that should definitely be happening. Categorization checks. And then there's this idea of, call it a deep web page analysis, but essentially it translates to a sandboxing of the URL in the cloud. So looking at JavaScript, looking at advertising, looking at what the page does. If you click through the link, what's on the next page then? And what do those links do? So applying that sophisticated checking, in many ways, like hyperscale and that cloud approach is very powerful in terms of being able to do that quickly without introducing a sense of latency for the end users. With the flow, obviously, if it's a good site, that's cool, it goes there. If it's a bad site, it should be blocked. A couple of things that we've seen become more and more important, certainly for teams reporting to the board, is the ability to get a view into what is happening and what's being protected against. So that idea of SIEM integrations becoming more and more of a requirement in the conversations that we have. So that ability to take the data from a solution that's providing URL protection, feed that into your SIEM, so your single pane of glass, you can see exactly what's going on, potentially correlate that with other attacks. And management dashboards kind of built into the solution as well. This dynamic user awareness idea. Companies like FishMe, you guys will see that they're here. They do a great job of that simulated attack and education. And I think more and more as we talk to security teams, it's about applying that best protection. But people are seeing more and more that it's actually critical for herd awareness within an organization. So that idea of test people, see how they go, educate, retest, and ultimately you want to get to the point where everybody within the organization kind of gets that they should think before they click on the link from AusPost, because did I actually get a package? And some of these are quite funny when you talk to security teams, where you'll have people clicking on, I got a subpoena from the AFP for, I don't know, like a missed fine or a parking fine in Canberra, and won't even think that I wasn't even in Canberra, so how would I possibly have a fine? But getting that sort of security awareness within an organization, we see it as becoming more and more kind of critical in terms of protection. So the idea here will be that you click on a link, you should have some ability to, as a security team or as an IT team, introduce a speed bump or awareness messaging into that action, so people are being trained as they do the thing they need to be trained on, if that makes sense. And that's becoming more and more of a kind of, I suppose, a deciding factor as people are looking at these solutions and the conversations we're having. To talk then to the attachment side of things, this really reflects the ASD recommendations around malicious emails last year. And their number one recommendation was around safe file format transcription. So that idea that you get a productivity file, so a Word doc, an Excel file, that what you can do is flatten that down and make it into a PDF. So there's no code there, there's no potential for exploit using a PDF file that's been flattened. They also recommend this idea of on-demand sandboxing. So from a productivity perspective, if you look at what people do with attachments, they generally don't need to make edits. Some parts of the business will, some parts won't, but the stats are somewhere around 80% of attachments that come through actually don't need to be edited at all. But that 20%, you want to be able to give the end users a way to self-serve and sandbox as required. And that's that sort of 2B option there. It's funny, so that's the number one recommendation. We've seen very little take-up of that in Australia, and nearly everybody that we work with has gone through this preemptive sandboxing, if you want to call it that. And I believe, there's always that balance between security and productivity, and you could have 100% security, but nobody can really do anything, and you can go the other way too. I feel like with sandboxing technology, it's now gotten so good. If you're using full system emulation sandboxing tech, so that idea, you emulate everything from the CPU, the operating system, your applications. It should be able to do things like mimic human mouse movement. That's a key one. So what's happening with sandboxes is that the malware creators are constantly trying to figure out ways to bypass or detect if they're in a sandbox, so they won't detonate in those environments. So it's a constant arms race between the sandbox technology and what the malware guys are doing. But that is a critical part in sort of a solid cyber resilience strategy for protection, is making sure that URLs are protected, but also there's something in place that will do sandboxing. Because you can analyze the code in a macro is fine, but what's it going to do? Is it going to connect to a command and control center? Is it trying to obfuscate code? Is it going to drop a PE on a machine? And getting that visibility into those actions so you can kind of take action as appropriate. The last part that we kind of tend to talk about is this idea of whaling attacks. And from the conversations outside, obviously, everybody's seeing some version of this in varying volumes and varying amounts. But traditionally, it's seen as a hard one to fight against. And the reasons for that is it's malwareless. There's no URL, there's no attachment, there's nothing to run through an engine as such. So in this case, what you really need to do is bring in scale. Look for patterns, look for things that will kind of indicate that potentially this is a whaling attack, and then allow some action to happen. And from the conversations, it's the same stuff all the time. You'll be able to use things like keywords, which in and of themselves, they're not enough. But really all you're doing is kind of taking note that the keywords that are here are suspicious. Things like the display name. So you'll often get a situation where folks will the attackers will register a Gmail account or a Big Ponds account or whatever, and use the name of a CFO or the head of HR, anyone who's got authority for what they want to extract from a company. So using that as an indicator. Domain proximity, so that idea of the Levenstein distance, so the number of edits to get to a new domain. And in 2015, in July, they had a go at us for 50 grand, and they registered Merncast. And the or and the n together, if you look at it in Outlook, you literally can't tell the difference. It looks exactly the same. But technology can pick up those differences, and again, use that as an indicator. Domain activity. So in our platform, we had to actually change how that worked. It started off as domain recency, and very quickly, what you could see happening was the attackers would register a domain, sit on it for 5 months, and then initiate an attack. So recency kind of doesn't really work. So we had to flick over, and we now use a feed for that indicates legitimate versus non-legitimate traffic for domains. And then the reply to address mismatching, which is, again, often present in whaling emails. So the idea here is to build a picture, and it's different for every company. There's different considerations. If you're a company that has a 3-letter domain, one character change, that's quite often going to be the case, right? So that sort of falls apart, that domain proximity. For other companies, keywords won't work, but it's kind of finding that thing, what are the previous attacks, and then basing your policies around that. We see companies as they come on board with us go with quarantining first. And the reason for that is with whaling attacks, this tends to be the one where, as I said, there's no malware, so it's not binary. You really start at a point, you do your best guess at what's going to help to kind of pick these up. And it goes up and down until you get to a sweet spot where actually your policies are working. You're picking up everything, but you're not getting false positives and causing hassles. So we'll often see the security and IT teams start with quarantining, make sure that they understand what's working, what's not working. And when it gets to a point where they're happy, they'll generally go with a 2-layer approach. So for the wider organization, if you look at somebody like me, I don't have authority to do a wire transfer. So there's no real risk in me getting a whaling attack because I don't have that power within Momcast. I literally can't transfer money. But if I'm a C-level or exco, then I can. So having that ability to quarantine for the exco, but for regular employees, maybe just tag that email. So they lean in, they can pay attention, maybe report it to the security or the IT team, but there's no impact to productivity, and business kind of continues. And that's that first part of cyber resilience. What are you going to do before to make sure that you're as safe and as protected as you possibly can be? The next part then really is around continuity. This is the idea of what do you do during an event. So whether that's an attack where something's happened and you've been popped by ransomware, and maybe there's a server that's being encrypted, or potentially it's just an outage and that's happened with a service provider. Really, continuity is about putting something in place to protect the wider organization, to protect the business and allow it to continue working as you go forward. So our approach here, again, it's that idea of making sure that there's something that's highly available that can take over in the event of an outage for Exchange or Office 365 or Google. So that idea that if there is something that happens, you've got apps, you've got a plugin for Outlook, whatever it might be. But with cyber resilience, the idea is that you've got engagement for your employee base. They don't have to go anywhere else. They don't have to learn how to do something. They can just continue doing what they were doing, a sort of business as usual kind of approach. And it's that idea of quick and seamlessly being able to switch over. So a big part of cyber resilience is moving away from having a DOR site where you've got to go there, spin things up, and potentially have an RPO or RTO of hours or potentially days sometimes. All of a sudden you can do that instantly, and there's no effect and no kind of impact to the business during an event. The last part, as I kind of finish up here, is around that data assurance piece. And again, that idea of hyperscale, how that plays into what's happening. WannaCry, it's the talk of the town at the moment. What happens if you get hit really badly by that, or by any other kind of sort of cyber attack? Having a second store of the data is kind of critical. Somewhere you can go back to, somewhere you can get it and restore it if you need to, but also interact with it quickly and easily. So that idea that enabling your admins to continue doing e-discovery, but also enabling the end users to be able to get an email they sent 5 years ago, or 5 minutes ago, or 5 weeks ago, reply to it, continue kind of working. So the data assurance and continuity in cyber resilience kind of work together, certainly in the email space, in terms of how your employees kind of work with that. So to kind of wrap up and sort of summarize it, I suppose the cyber resilience idea, it's stuff that we probably have done for a long time, but it's a perspective on assuming something will go wrong. So is it a malicious attack? How do you combat those attacks? If it does happen, what are you going to do to continue operations while that event is happening? So that business continuity idea, and then that idea of data assurance. And those last two, like I said, they kind of play together in terms of the BCP stuff, so that you get the option to continue business as usual without kind of affecting your end users too much. And then that idea that hyperscale and cloud specifically aligns very strongly with the idea of cyber resilience, and that idea that there's different types of cloud. So really hyperscale is kind of the one that facilitates that idea of combating attacks using sophisticated checks, continuity, high availability, something that's always there, and always being able to deliver data back to the end user base very quickly for the data assurance piece. So with that, just say thanks. I'll also kind of take some questions. If anyone's keen or has any thoughts or comments, I'm more than happy to grab a few questions. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for your time, and hopefully that was useful and information.
Well, if we don't have any questions, can everyone join me in thanking Garrett for the presentation.
Thanks, guys. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
We've got about 10 to 15 minutes until the next session starts, so you've got plenty of time if you want to change rooms to get round to the other end. Otherwise, go outside and have a coffee and chat to the vendors.